Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I'm continuing my series about the history of the Soviet Union. I'm looking at the 1930s, and I'm going to focus particularly on educational policy. One of the few unarguable achievements of Stalin's rule was the improvement in literacy. The Soviet Supremo, Stalin, had been running the country since 1928, somewhat 1924, but clearly he was the boss by 1928. And at least 60% of the population was still illiterate in 1928. By the time he died in 1953, this figure was down to about 10%. And those people who were still illiterate would often have been elderly, living in the most inaccessible regions, coming from some deeply traditional communities where they sometimes didn't like education, viewed teachers as communist agents. To be fair, that was partly true. Disapprove of education for women and so on. And these would be among some of the non-Russian ethnicities, among some of the nomad groups. So communist activists had begun teaching Red Army troops to read during the Civil War. They tried primers which were aimed at little children. Phrases such as Masha yella kashu, Masha ate the porridge. These were ridiculous and adults found them demeaning. In a flash of inspiration, one teacher came up with the idea of writing a primer that would be welcomed by the soldiers, and came up with this phrase: slaves we are not slaves. Red Army troopers warmed to that one, and even in the 1990s many people could recall that one as the first sentence they'd ever learned to read. So Red Army troopers had Cyrillic letters attached to their backs as they rode along to help them read the alphabet, because they could be reading them on the backs of their comrades' tunics. Books were sold very cheaply indeed, more affordable than bread, so sold at a loss. Foreign books were published in Russian, and the USSR did not pay any royalties to foreign writers, as it did not recognize foreign copyright. That would be capitalism. Atheism was taught in schools along with Marxist-Leninism. At university, whichever subject one studied, one had to study communist theory, and that took up a third of the timetable. I met a pharmacist who'd had to do a lot of that. History was written to show communists in as good a light as possible and to denigrate all the Tsars, none of whom had ever done anything remotely laudable. Previous rebels were exalted. However, sometimes they turned out to be bourgeois nationalists, and then they'd turn out to be proto-communists. The government couldn't quite make up its mind. I can't remember who quipped that, in the Soviet Union, history was always changing. Only the future was certain, the triumph of communism globally. Foreign inventions were often claimed to be invented by the Soviets. Many people in Russia today will tell you that Popov invented the radio. Now, that might be true, I don't know. Most people believe it's Guglielmo Marconi, the Irish Italian, but I've no dog in this fight. I'm quite willing to accept it was the Russian. I don't know that. Well, there are more examples like that. The Soviet Union invented the helicopter and things. Corporal punishment had been used in the Soviet Union prior to the revolution, but the USSR abolished it in the 1920s. The USSR was almost alone doing without it. It was a curious anomaly and a welcome one to do that when the Soviet state was so brutal to its citizens in all other regards. So all careers and all subjects were open to women all of a sudden. So that was a step forward. So education was increased, but it very much had to be the party line, had to be indoctrinating people with communist ideology, and that had to be a Marxist view of everything, of music and the arts, and socialist realism had to be advanced. Agitprop, as in agitation propaganda, literally shaking the people to make them believe in the communist message, to denounce capitalism as exploitation, foreign governments as oppressive, that communism was going to emancipate the whole human race. That was the way forward. Anyway, in the early 1920s, the Soviet Union had welcomed all that was audacious and new in the arts. The nuclear family was even under attack as patriarchal and capitalist. Marx had talked about the common ownership of the means of production. Perhaps this applied to women as well. Modern art was encouraged. Remember, the 1920s was a near a great experimentation, Dadaism and so on. The Rococo style of it. School uniform was abolished. The Soviet Union was at the vanguard of all that was groundbreaking in the arts and in society. Contraception was freely available, abortion was illegalized, divorce was granted on demand by one of the spouses. So it seemed to be the most feminist country in the world as well. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union underwent the Cultural Retreat. Divorce became tricky and lengthy to obtain. Abortion was outlawed because Stalin wanted to increase the population. However, it still went on illegally quite a lot. The primacy of the nuclear family was restored to central place in the Soviet thinking. There have been a huge number of orphans in the 1920s. People have fled, people have been killed, and Stalin saw this as destabilizing society. He wanted a more authoritarian system, and the family unit was useful. However, loyalty to the state came first. Socialist realism in the arts was to be the new genre. That was to be exalted. This is extended to writing as well as to plastic arts. Although to some extent traditional art forms were lauded, such as opera and ballet, and well funded. What else was I going to say? So Stalin took most lively interest in the theatre. Stanislavski was a director whom he held in high regard, and you can still see his house on Leontievsky Lane in Moscow. There was a small stage there where there were dress rehearsals were held with minimal costume, makeup, lighting, anything like that. Just the pure acting. We're said to have found the golden mean between between, how to put it, theatricality and realism. Traditional teaching methods were brought back, as well as some traditional aspects of the arts. But nevertheless, the arts were to be advancing the communist message, such as communism would definitely win, communism was the way forward, it was social justice, capitalism was necessarily exploitative. Many nationalists were bourgeois. Being a Soviet nationalist was fine, but being, let's say, an Azerbaijani nationalist or a Belarusian nationalist was dreadful. And all the other Tsars were wicked. Stalin was the greatest man of all time, was a genius, a hero, and the dearest friend of Lenin, things like that. So you saw it in music as well. So some types of music were said to be un-Stalinist or un-Marxist. There'd be Marxism in biology and chemistry and physics. Anything that Stalin didn't like was like that. So he got a great deal of time for Trimofey Lysenko, this self-taught biologist, as he had no academic qualifications, who believed in winter grain and nonsense like that you could grow grain in the most inhospitable conditions. Of course, it was drivel, but any biologist who told the truth was going to the gulag, and many people died because they were sent to grow grain in places where it just wasn't going to grow. There was also a terrible famine in Kazakhstan in the 1930s. Up to a third of the population died in 3 years when Stalin said, no more, no medicine. You itinerants, no longer wandering with your herds of horses or camels, stay put, here's some seed, farm. Given minimal equipment, no training, no buildings, and if they were lucky, they'd get one crop. Then the thin soil would fail and they would all die because they knew what they were doing. They'd been on the steppe for millennia, that following herds of horses, living off their meat and milk and living in yurts, going in search of fresh pasture and more water, that was the best way to survive. They knew what they were doing in that biome. But Stalin ideology came first, and he imposed this on them, which is why huge numbers of them died. Those who settled in towns or working in industries were Communist Party members, they were more likely to be fed and not be forced into this disastrous collectivization. So that's a little bit about the 1930s, some of the achievements and some of the cataclysms. But certainly education would be quite a cataclysm. Obviously they didn't favour academic freedom or exchange of ideas or the quest for truth. Certain spheres they did, and they did spread literacy. So on that regard, the Soviets have to be applauded, and for advancing gender equality. But obviously the communist government was dreadful to its people. This is absolutely not anti-Soviet or anti-Russian. Obviously I have the greatest sympathy for the Soviet and the Russian people, just pointing out how previous governments have mistreated them, and indeed the Soviet government in the last few days of the Soviet Union recognised this. The government of the Russian Federation likewise has recognised that almost everything I'm saying is true likewise. So not pointing the blame, not trying to be insulting to anyone, and not crowing over anybody's suffering, but telling the historical truth so that we can profit by avoiding some disasters in the future. And do not infer from what I've said that I'm suggesting that my country is blameless or something like that, or that any nationality is culpable. Nobody's born bad. So this is part of the objective search for truth.